So where were we? What was the question?
No, perfect. Was what are the guiding principles? What are the guiding principles? Who are the actors within them? And then how you see trends in operationalisation and implementation.
Right. So what we're finding since the guiding principles were issued is we're finding that the ability of various actors to now begin to implement the guiding principles within their own spheres of influence has become the point of the exercise. Now that a proclamation has been issued by the United Nations, it really depends on how people are choosing to react to that. And so you find various levels of maturity going on. Obviously, Western countries that have more resources, that have more transparency and openness in their supply chains, particularly because of the kind of consumer pressures that they've been facing from their domestic markets, mean that they have been able to qualify why their responses have been so immediate to the guiding principles. And of course, because the guiding principles are primarily oriented out of Geneva, out of here, they're structured in English, and they tend to play to the Western audience in that fashion. So that's where we are with the guiding principles now. But what we're finding, and this is why it's very important that we have discussions like this with communities that are outside of Europe, because these are the types of discussions that ensure that if the guiding principles hold true, that they are not merely a construct that is designed for a certain set of actors in the north of particular maturity. Really what you want to be able to do is to apply the guiding principles at any level of development. Universally, exactly, that's right.
Fantastic. And we've also been hearing about this post-2015 architecture, and we've been hearing about this in the context of the Global Compact. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about this and how it relates both to the guiding principles and to initiatives that are taking place around the world to implement them.
Certainly. So the post-2015 agenda is the next big step for the United Nations in terms of, if we presume that the core competency, the core legitimacy of the United Nations stems around three areas: security, human rights, and development.
Right.
So the post-2015 agenda has to address, in a very qualitative fashion, what the Millennium Development Goals originally tried to address in a more targeted fashion by setting actual figures to say we need to hit certain things by a certain date. Now the important
clear targets and goals.
That was the MDGs, exactly. So now with the SDGs, what we're finding is that since the MDGs, we realize that the goals themselves give you a figure, but they don't give you a feel as to whether you're doing the right thing. And the consultations that have led up to the SDGs revolve around issues such as inequality, such as the greater meaning of livelihoods and sustainability in a planetary context, and what does that mean? So I think there's more recognition now of the kind of trade-offs that the actors, states and businesses and ultimately communities and individuals have to have made in order to get to the point that we are today. Now, one of the biggest issues, of course, that comes to the center of all of this is human rights, because ultimately you can save the whales and you can save the trees and you can save everything, but if you don't save the people,
absolutely,
you've got no benefit that is being derived by communities and how it is that they're going to be able to use those environmental benefits or biodiversity benefits or carbon benefits and plug it into their sort of economic growth and their development. And ultimately, of course, then if these things are not managed, then you get into situations of conflict, which goes back to the other issue of peace and how do you promote peace and keep the peace within the United Nations framework. So human rights and post-2015 are absolutely interlinked. They need to be considered in the context of culture, because sometimes the language of human rights differs from country to country and from place to place. So maybe what we're talking about is social well-being or harmonious society, however we want to phrase it, but ultimately it recognizes the context of the individual, the community, and then sovereign obligations together with all the economic drivers that play upon that individual, companies and so forth.
And in terms of initiatives that have been that are ongoing to promote this and to recognise that companies can be a positive force in promoting these ideas, and also in looking at their own operations to try and work out where they might be having a negative impact. One of the initiatives that has been undertaken at Co-Roundtable is called the Nippon CSR Consortium. Have you heard of this?
Yes.
And how do you see that linking in then with the post-2015 development architecture, and how do you see that linking in then with the guiding principles?
Okay. Well, the post-2015 agenda recognizes collective action as a whole. So it really requires that people do not feel, and actors, companies and so forth, do not feel as though they are necessarily singular pioneers in a space anymore. So a collective like the Nippon CSR Consortium brings like-minded organizations together in the pursuit of a like-minded or a collective goal.
Right.
And if that goal is an issue such as human rights, then that plays very much into the heart of the post-2015 agenda, as we've said. So I think that the opportunity for an organization like the Nippon CSR Consortium is to be able to bring a lot of the discussions that perhaps have been had in a different language or in a different place into the East Asian context, into the Japanese context particularly, because the economic power of the Japanese base and its influence throughout the region, and of course globally, is unquestionable. What we need to ensure is that the way that the human rights language is translated into an Asian context is translated in a culturally appropriate manner.
Yes.
It's not simply a question of words. It's a question of how actions have been held and done for generations. And sometimes I think making this balance between the realities of a past and the needs of today
Absolutely.
can only be expressed by people who've experienced both. You cannot import a logic from another place and suddenly expect it to work. So I think a grouping like the Nippon CSR Consortium has the responsibility, if they are the leading organizations who are looking at human rights and
in their own supply
in
chains,
their own supply
and,
chains
in their
and so
operations.
forth, and within that sphere of economic activity, the Japanese sphere, they have the blue ocean, to consider how is human rights going to be framed, and I think that's the opportunity that they have.
Fantastic. And if you had some advice for Japanese companies, going forward to make sure that their voices are heard in this area, and to be, as you know, companies face so many constraints in terms of time, in terms of their resources, and I guess sometimes feel that this is yet another issue that they have to grapple with in their day-to-day. What would you say to Japanese companies in terms of why you feel that really prioritizing human rights, and performing human rights due diligence, and getting involved in initiatives that assist them to do so it is a good idea for them and will be of benefit to them?
I think that the first thing is, don't be afraid. There is probably nothing new here other than the way that something is being presented. But once you move past the language, the sensitivities and so forth that are associated with the subject, I think that many Japanese companies will find that at the core of human rights are values that they have been practicing for years.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
Yes.
Once that hurdle is breached, it becomes very easy to recognize why all of the things that you've been doing as a business for the last 100 years are obviously important because you've been doing them. And a large part of that will already be tied in some way to communal benefit, to economic growth, to poverty alleviation, to education, to training, to capacity building, all of these things which companies, and arguably companies in Asia, are so much better at putting at the core of their profit motive than other companies. I mean, in many cases, Asian companies recognize the collective good as being the primary driver for their entire economic activity.
Right.
So I think that the demonstration of leadership by Asian companies, particularly Japanese companies that have very long-term views, very long-term horizons on this strategy, is a relatively easy thing.
Yes.
So as soon as we're not afraid of the fact that it's not in Japanese,
Sure.
and we get past that,
Yeah.
then it's as I say, it's a blue ocean.
Wonderful. And specifically, I guess, drilling down a little just in terms of human rights due diligence. As you say, processes of understanding risk and of understanding benefits to communities, of understanding impacts to communities is something that's very dear to Japanese companies, and they have been looking at for decades, if not longer. Specifically now, we're asking companies to be thinking about human rights due diligence and their impacts. Could you give us a snapshot of how, for example, some companies may be missing certain elements of that, or why this is really useful as a new way of looking at this subject?
Right. Risk, I think, is a very significant driver of decision making in companies, irrespective of whatever type of risk. Human rights risk is a new dimension of risk that is perhaps less understood and less easily encapsulated than other types of risk. And the reason for that, of course, is because you have people involved.
Right.
It's not simply machinery or the weather or so forth, but you actually have people who think and so forth, and how it is that it impacts them. So when it comes to the due diligence portion, I think applying risk methodology that is traditional is a good way to start.
Yes.
But then applying some of the newer, and when I say new, I mean the last maybe 20 years of stakeholder engagement, of stakeholder mapping, of consultation and dialogue. These processes are probably less familiar to companies, particularly companies that maybe sit within a B2B framework as opposed to a B2C framework.
Right.
So I think even if you're a B2B company and you're within a supply chain or a value chain, being able to apply the thinking of mapping where your impacts are, whom it is that they impact, putting yourself in someone else's shoes.
Yes.
This is the skill set that will now inform the risk models that you have been using for other more static situations.
Yes.
And once I think we get our heads around the idea that this is all very dynamic and that it is constantly changing. So a due diligence that one runs for human rights changes every time a new member of that community comes of age.
Right.
Because they want now new things. So as long as we're prepared for that level of dynamic flexibility, exactly, then it's simply another part of doing business.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Poovan, for your time. We really appreciate it. And I know that the Japanese companies of Nippon CSR Consortium are very excited to be involved in this process. It's a very dynamic area. It's a very exciting area. And as Poovan has said, it's an area at which you want to be at the forefront. Thanks again for your time, Poovan, and thanks for having us.
Thank you.